I need to talk to you about your silence. The way you went quiet when other people expected you to fight back. The way you stopped explaining yourself to people who had already decided what they thought of you. The way you pulled back from spaces that were draining you, removed yourself from conversations that were going nowhere, and chose peace over being understood by people who were not trying to understand you. The people around you read that silence as weakness, as defeat, as someone who had run out of things to say, as confirmation that their version of your story, the limited, small, manageable version they needed you to stay inside, was correct. They were wrong about everything. Your silence was not weakness, and what is coming after it is going to prove that in a way that leaves them no room to reinterpret. I am going to show you exactly what your silence was, and exactly what your rise is going to do to every assumption they made while you were quiet. Stay until point 7, because point 7 reveals the thing about your silence that even you did not fully understand, and once you hear it, you will carry it as the most powerful truth about yourself you have ever owned. Type silent rising in the comments. Let the universe know you are in the quiet season before the rise. Before the points, one essential understanding. The chosen ones have always made the same move before their most significant breakthroughs. They go quiet, not because they have nothing to say, because they have too much to waste on the wrong conversations, because the energy they were giving to explaining themselves, defending their choices, and managing other people's perceptions of them was energy that belonged to the mission. And in the silence, while the people who were watching thought nothing was happening, everything was happening. The chosen ones who rise the highest are almost always the ones who went the quietest right before they did. The silence was not the absence of movement. It was movement at a depth that the people watching the surface could not see. What they mistook for stillness was the most active season of the chosen one's life. Here is what your silence actually was, and what your rise is about to prove. 1. Your silence was not defeat. It was strategy they could not read. You stopped reacting. At some point in this journey, after enough energy wasted on people who were not worth the conversation, you made a decision that most people never make. You decided that your peace was more valuable than being right in front of people who were not ready to receive what you were saying. And from the outside, to the people who had been counting on your reactions to confirm their narrative about you, that silence looked like defeat, like you had finally accepted the version of your story they had been writing, like you had stopped fighting because you had stopped believing. What they could not see is that the silence was the most strategic move you have ever made. Because you cannot manipulate someone whose reactions you cannot predict. You cannot control someone who has stopped playing the game. You cannot write someone's story when they have walked off the stage you built for them. Your silence removed you from every dynamic they thought they had over you, and they have been confused by it ever since. The chosen one who goes quiet is not the one who ran out of ammunition. They are the one who recognized that the battle they were being invited to fight was not the battle worth winning. The real battle was happening in the silence, and they were winning it the whole time. My silence was strategy. I removed myself from battles that were not mine to win. The real work was happening in the quiet. Type strategic in the comments if your silence was never weakness. It was a move they could not calculate. 2. Your silence was building what their noise could not. While you were quiet, you were building. Not loudly, not in ways that were visible to the people who needed the performance of progress to believe it was real, but in the deep, consistent, unglamorous way that actual foundations are built. You were working on yourself in ways that could not be announced, healing wounds that required private work, developing clarity that only comes in silence, building the internal architecture that the next level of your life requires. Meanwhile, the people who mistook your silence for stillness were making noise, performing their progress, seeking confirmation that their choices were right, filling every available space with the sound of movement because the quiet made them uncomfortable, because in the quiet, they would have had to sit with themselves. And sitting with themselves was something they had been avoiding for a very long time. You were not avoiding anything. You were building everything. And what was built in the silence is about to be revealed. The noise they made cannot compete with what the quiet produced. What you built in the silence required the silence to build it. The foundation of the next chapter of your life was laid in the season when no one was watching. It was laid in the quiet decisions, the private faithfulness, the invisible work that produced something the noise never could. What is coming is the evidence of what the silence built. 3. Your silence confused them, and that confusion protected you. Here is something your silence did that you probably did not realize. It confused them. The people who had patterns of behavior with you, who knew how to push your buttons, what would make you react, what emotional levers produced predictable responses, suddenly found themselves operating without a map. They expected a reaction. You gave them silence. They expected an explanation. You gave them nothing. They expected to see you struggling visibly so they could position themselves around it. And instead you went quiet and stayed quiet. And the confusion that produced in them was one of the most effective forms of protection you have ever given yourself. Because you cannot target what you cannot predict. You cannot strategize against someone who has removed themselves from your field of operation. You cannot write someone into a corner when they have stopped standing in the spaces you prepared for them. Your silence confused them, and their confusion was your shield. Type protected in the comments if your silence confused the people who thought they had you figured out, and that confusion kept you safe while you rebuilt. 4. Your silence was the chosen one's most ancient power move. The chosen ones who changed history across every era, every culture, every domain, all made the same move at the critical moment. They went quiet, not because they had nothing to say, because they recognized that the next season required a depth of focus that the noise of managing other people's perceptions would not permit. Every significant rise in history was preceded by a period of withdrawal, quiet, and what the outside world read as inactivity. The world called it hiding, history called it preparation. You are in that lineage right now. Your silence is not a modern coping mechanism. It is the oldest and most powerful move available to someone who understands that the energy given to the wrong battles is energy taken from the right ones. The chosen ones who came before you made this move. They were misread for it. And then they rose, and what they built in the silence spoke so loudly that the people who called their quiet weakness never recovered from the embarrassment of having said it. Your rise is going to do the same thing. Every chosen one who ever chose silence before their rise was connected to something wiser than the noise around them. They heard the frequency of the mission more clearly because they removed the interference. You removed the interference. The mission is speaking clearly now, and what it is building in you is almost ready. 5. Your silence was the universe removing you from what was beneath you. Some of the spaces you went quiet in, some of the rooms you stopped performing for, some of the relationships you stepped back from, some of the conversations you let go without resolution, were spaces you had outgrown. Not dramatically, not in ways that produced a clear ending. You just stopped fitting. The conversations felt smaller. The dynamics felt more draining. The people felt more fixated on things that no longer carried the weight they once did for you. And instead of fighting it or explaining it or trying to make the old spaces fit the expanding version of yourself, you went quiet and pulled back and let the distance grow. What the people in those spaces read as rejection, coldness, or abandonment was actually elevation. The universe was pulling you up, out of environments that belonged to a version of your life that was completing. into the space and silence required for the next version to form. Your silence was not you leaving something behind. It was you being lifted above it. I was not retreating, I was being elevated. The spaces I went quiet in belonged to a level I had outgrown. The silence was me rising. Type elevated in the comments if the silence was never about shrinking. It was the universe lifting you above what could no longer hold you. 6. Your rise is already happening, and it is too late for them to stop it. Here is something important you need to understand about where you are right now. The rise has already begun. Not in the visible sense, not yet in the ways that the people who doubted you will be able to see and confront, but in the invisible sense, in the momentum, the positioning, the spiritual clearance, the identity formation. It has already started. And the most important thing about momentum is that once it has begun at the level yours has, it cannot be stopped by anything the external world sends. Not by the doubt of the people who are watching. Not by the opinions of the ones who built their comfort around your limitation. Not by the circumstances that still look challenging on the surface. The rise is in motion. It is building speed. And the visible evidence, the external confirmation that even the most stubborn doubters will have to acknowledge, is coming. It is already too late for them to stop it. It was too late the moment you chose to keep going. The chosen one's rise becomes unstoppable not when the external world changes, but when the chosen one themselves can no longer be talked out of their own destiny. You have reached that point. The rise is not coming. It is happening. The question is only how long before the people who doubted you can see what was always already in motion. 7. Your silence was the most powerful declaration you ever made, and they heard every word. And the 7th point, the one I told you to stay for. The thing about your silence that even you did not fully understand. Your silence was not the absence of a message. It was the most powerful message you have ever sent. When you stopped explaining yourself, you said, "My worth does not require your understanding." When you stopped defending your choices, you said, "I answer to something higher than your opinion of me." When you stopped performing for rooms that were not worth the performance, you said, "My gifts belong to people who can receive them, not to people who use them to define what is available to me." When you chose peace over being right, you said, "The war you invited me to fight is beneath what I was built for." Every single thing your silence said the doubters heard. They could not articulate it. They called it attitude, coldness, arrogance, defeat, but they heard it. And it unsettled them. Because people who have built their sense of power on their ability to produce reactions in others, when those reactions stop coming, when the person they thought they understood goes quiet and stays quiet and rises without fanfare or announcement, they are confronted with the only version of power they cannot contain. Indifference to their approval. That is what your silence declared. And your rise is going to confirm it so completely that the declaration will never need to be repeated. Your silence was never empty. It was full of the decision to stop giving your power to people who were not worthy of it, full of the choice to preserve what you carried for something real, full of the faith that what you were building in the quiet was more significant than anything the noise could produce. That declaration, made in silence, was heard in heaven, and heaven is about to respond in a language even your enemies can understand. Type declaration in the comments. Your silence was a declaration. Own it. The people who misread it are about to find out exactly what it meant. Say all 7 with me, out loud. Like someone who just understood that every quiet season was a power move the doubters never learned to read. My silence was strategy, not defeat. They could not calculate what they could not predict. My silence was building what their noise never could. My silence confused them, and their confusion was my protection. My silence was the oldest move of the chosen, made by everyone who rose before me. My silence was elevation, the universe lifting me above what could no longer hold me. My rise is already in motion. It is too late to stop it. It always was. And my silence was the most powerful declaration I ever made. Heaven heard every word. They confused my silence for weakness. My rise is about to destroy that assumption permanently. If someone in your life misread your silence, if someone built a story about you based on your quiet and forgot that the quiet ones are always building something, share this video with them. Not aggressively, just quietly, the same way you do everything. Subscribe for a new message every morning. I am here every day. I will see you tomorrow. Your silence confused them. Your rise will destroy everything they assumed, and they will have nothing left to say.